On Friday, August 9, 2019, Mark Langford, a 8-year-old father, his 5-year-old wife Lisa, and their 9-year-old son Andrew, set off from their home in Denver, Colorado, with nothing but the promise of a quiet weekend in nature. The family had planned a camping trip to the Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park, a remote area known for its rugged beauty and isolation. Mark had reserved a spot at a secluded campsite, miles from the crowds, and the plan was simple: spend one night at a viewpoint overlooking the canyon, then hike one of the nearby trails the following morning. They packed a tent, sleeping bags, food, and a gas stove, ensuring they had everything for a peaceful stay away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. As they journeyed south, the weather turned unpredictable, with clouds gathering in the sky, but there was no hint of the horror that would unfold. That evening, Mark made one final call to his sister, telling her they had arrived and set up camp. The last words she would hear from him were, "The weather is changing, but everything is fine so far." Little did she know, it would be the last time anyone would hear from the Langford family. By the morning of August 10, 2019, the Langford family was supposed to be out on the trail, taking in the panoramic views from one of the lookout points in Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park. Mark, Lisa, and their son Andrew had arrived the day before, excited for the peaceful retreat away from the busyness of their everyday lives. They had set up camp at a secluded spot, chosen specifically for its quiet, isolated nature. The plan was simple: a brief overnight stay with a morning hike on August 10th, followed by an exploration of the side trails. However, when the day began, there were no signs of the Langfords on the trail, nor did anyone passing by report seeing them at the camp. At first, their absence didn't raise alarm. The family's lack of appearance on the trail was chalked up to the possibility that they had taken an alternative route or decided to enjoy the solitude of their camp for longer than expected. It wasn't uncommon for hikers and campers to deviate from their plans. But as the day wore on, and the Langfords still hadn't been seen or heard from, a creeping sense of unease began to settle in. By the evening of August 10th, the family still hadn't made contact with anyone. Relatives began to worry, particularly since the last communication they had received was from Mark on the evening of August 9th, when he had called his sister to confirm their arrival at the campsite. The conversation had been brief, but reassuring. Nothing seemed amiss at the time. "The weather is changing, but everything is fine so far," Mark had said before the connection dropped. Those were the final words his sister would ever hear from him. No follow-up calls came, no messages. The absence of any updates was out of character for the family. On the morning of August 11th, a full day after they were meant to be on their hike, relatives began to call the park authorities, expressing their concern that they had not heard from the Langfords. The rangers, initially dismissing it as a possible delay, soon realized something was wrong. The family had not been seen by any other visitors, and the Langfords' car was still parked at the designated lot. As the hours passed, the situation became increasingly worrisome. It wasn't until August 12th that rangers started a formal search. They scoured the campsites in the southern part of the canyon, focusing on the areas around the south rim where the family had planned to stay. But with the park's vast, rugged terrain, finding the Langfords wasn't an easy task. The terrain was treacherous, and many of the campsites were situated far from the main trails, making it difficult for anyone to find a misplaced hiker without knowing exactly where to look. Finally, on August 13th, 2 rangers patrolling the Wallop area, the southern edge of the canyon, stumbled upon something alarming. They spotted a tent camp just 50 yards from a vertical cliff edge, lying on its side. It was immediately clear that something was wrong. The tent skylines had been torn from the ground, and the camp appeared to be hastily abandoned. Nearby, a broken lantern lay discarded, along with an empty cooler, a folding shovel, and other camping equipment. Drag marks on the ground led towards the tent from the other side, suggesting that something or someone had been moved. The scene was unsettling, but the rangers didn't yet know the extent of the horror they would soon discover. Upon opening the tent, they were met with a chilling sight. The bodies of Mark, Lisa, and Andrew Langford, all found inside. Their hands and feet had been bound tightly with synthetic cord, and a tarp with what appeared to be bloodstains covered their bodies. The discovery was horrific, but there were no immediate signs of a struggle. The lack of any visible wounds on the bodies made it even more perplexing. Forensic experts would later confirm that the deaths had occurred the night the family had arrived at the campsite on the evening of August 9th. The area around the tent showed signs of movement, partially erased footprints, presumably from someone wearing large boots, leading towards an unofficial trail that dropped into the canyon. The rangers couldn't have known it at the time, but these were the first signs that the case was far from ordinary. Whoever had been responsible for the family's deaths was still out there, and the investigation had just begun. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that there were far more questions than answers. The scene was puzzling, with evidence that didn't quite fit the expected narrative. A robbery had been speculated, given the missing belongings, including the family's backpacks, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. But the lack of any obvious weapon, combined with the eerie calm of the scene, made it hard to draw any conclusions. The bodies were discovered in the tent, suggesting that the family had been attacked while they were still inside, perhaps unaware of the danger that approached them. But the motive for the attack, if it was a robbery or something more sinister, remained a mystery. As investigators began to dig deeper, they uncovered even more unsettling clues. A man's blood, not belonging to any of the victims, was found on some of the camping equipment, and as the search continued, it became apparent that this was no ordinary crime. The Langfords hadn't simply vanished, they had been murdered. The investigation into the tragedy was only just beginning, but the authorities knew one thing for sure. Whoever was responsible was still out there, and they were closer than anyone realized. When the rangers opened the tent, they were met with a sight that would haunt them forever. Inside, the bodies of Mark, Lisa, and Andrew Langford were discovered, lifeless and arranged in an unsettling way. Their hands and feet were bound tightly with synthetic cord, and a blood-soaked tarp had been draped over them, hiding the extent of the brutality they had endured. The scene was eerily still, as if the world outside had never existed for them. The family, who had set off just days earlier with the intent to enjoy a peaceful weekend in the mountains, had met with an unimaginable fate. They had been murdered, though the exact cause was not immediately clear. The area surrounding the tent was a key part of the puzzle. There were no signs of a violent struggle, yet the family's belongings had been carelessly scattered around the campsite, and their evening suggesting that whoever had attacked them had either been in a hurry or didn't care to cover their tracks. Nearby, a broken lantern lay abandoned, the cooler overturned, and a folding shovel was left askew on the ground. Drag marks were visible, leading away from the tent and toward the canyon's edge, hinting at an effort to move something or someone. But what had been moved and why remained unclear. The footprints found in the rocky terrain appeared to be from large boots, and though they were partially erased by the wind and rain, they hinted at someone trying to escape or perhaps conceal their actions. The details were beginning to stack up, but there was still too much left to be understood. As forensic experts arrived at the scene to gather evidence, they made an unsettling discovery. The synthetic cord used to bind the Langfords was not an ordinary type of rope. It was industrial-grade cord, commonly used in mountaineering and water sports. This was an unusual find. The type of cord suggested that the perpetrator might have had some experience with outdoor activities, perhaps even a professional. This detail began to paint a picture of someone who was familiar with the rugged terrain of the canyon and knew how to handle themselves in such a challenging environment. It wasn't the kind of material typically associated with the average camper. Even more perplexing was the discovery of blood samples at the scene that didn't belong to any of the Langfords. It wasn't just a small trace either. There were significant traces of blood found on the tarpaulin, covering the bodies, and even on some of the camping gear scattered around the site. The forensic team was quick to collect these samples, but the mystery deepened when they realized that the DNA didn't match that of the victims. There was blood from another person, someone completely unknown. This piece of evidence raised a disturbing question. Had there been a second individual at the campsite, or was there someone else involved in the crime? The DNA samples would need further analysis, but this new development left investigators with more questions than answers. As the investigation progressed, authorities began to focus on potential suspects. One name in particular began to stand out. James Caldwell, a 46-year-old man who had a criminal history, was brought to the attention of investigators. Caldwell had previously been convicted of assault at a campsite in Utah, and his name had surfaced during the preliminary investigation. A man with a violent past, Caldwell became a prime person of interest. His suspicious behavior in the days leading up to the Langford family's disappearance was examined closely. He was known to be a frequent visitor of the park, and the possibility that he might have been in the area during the Langford's trip couldn't be ignored. It wasn't long before investigators began to build a case around him. Caldwell's vehicle, a blue Ford Ranger, was spotted near the trail leading to the southern cliff on the evening of August 9th. Witnesses reported seeing him alone, carrying a large backpack, which seemed out of place, given the quiet and isolated nature of the area. His presence at the campsite on the same night that the Langfords had arrived raised alarm bells. But when investigators questioned him, Caldwell denied ever being near the Langfords' parking spot. His alibi seemed shaky at best. He claimed he had spent the night in his car and had left early on August 10th. To corroborate his story, investigators requested footage from nearby motels and gas stations, hoping to find something that could either confirm or disprove Caldwell's whereabouts that night. Surprisingly, the footage from a local motel captured Caldwell in the parking lot at around 1 a.m. on August 10th. This gave him a partial alibi, at least for the period after the alleged murder. However, the lack of further evidence linking him directly to the crime scene left investigators with more doubts than certainty. The possibility that Caldwell might be involved couldn't be ruled out, but there was still no definitive proof connecting him to the Langfords' deaths. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued to comb through the evidence. The blood found on the scene was now suspected to belong to a man who had not yet been identified. The fact that it wasn't Mark, Lisa, or Andrew's blood added a disturbing layer of complexity to the case. The authorities also discovered that the tarpaulin used to cover the bodies had strange handprints and fingerprints on it, some of which were identifiable as belonging to Mark and Lisa. But there were two sets of prints that didn't match anyone in the Langford family. These prints weren't in any criminal database, which meant that the person responsible was either a stranger or someone who hadn't been caught by the authorities before. As the investigation deepened, the number of leads continued to grow, but so did the frustration. While Caldwell's name was prominently featured in the investigation, there was still no clear link between him and the actual crime. As the authorities continued to pursue this lead, the question remained: who was the mysterious person whose blood was found at the scene, and what was their connection to the Langfords? The case was far from being solved, but with each new clue, the investigators were inching closer to uncovering the chilling truth. The investigation had reached a point where every lead seemed to go cold, but then, just as it appeared that the case might slip into obscurity, a new piece of information surfaced. One of the guides working in the area had seen something that, in hindsight, would prove to be crucial. The guide, who had been working near the southern edge of Black Canyon, reported that on the afternoon of August 9th, he had observed a man speaking to someone who matched the description of the mysterious individual whose blood had been found at the crime scene. This man was reportedly arguing with another person, demanding that they clear the way. The conversation had been tense, with raised voices, but the guide hadn't thought much of it at the time. The mysterious man with the tattoo, a small triangle on his forearm, became a key focus of the investigation. The guide hadn't seen the tattoo clearly, but the mention of it was enough to spark an important connection. The triangle symbol was not a common tattoo, and it seemed odd that a man in the area, potentially involved in a heated conversation, might have it. The description he provided fit someone that the investigators had been looking into, a local man named Greg Hansen. Hansen was a 40-year-old man from Montrose, a small town not far from the canyon, and he was known in the area as a private rafting and sport fishing guide. He wasn't a stranger to the park or its rugged terrain. Hansen had permits to conduct tours along the Gunnison River, and he frequently took clients on excursions through the canyon. His knowledge of the area was extensive, and he seemed to be the kind of person who could navigate the canyon with ease, something that would become a significant point in the investigation. As investigators dug into his background, they uncovered troubling details. Greg Hansen had a history of water safety violations and had been cited for unlicensed possession of firearms. He wasn't a criminal mastermind, but his history of minor infractions suggested that he might have a disregard for the law. And while his professional reputation as a guide was solid in many respects, his personal history raised some concerns. He wasn't officially registered as a park visitor during the days the Langfords went missing, which seemed odd for someone so familiar with the area. What was even more concerning was the growing realization that Hansen might have been in the park the night the Langfords died. His movements on the evening of August 9th were becoming more suspicious. A camera at the entrance to the park had recorded an SUV with a trailer entering the park at around 10:38 p.m., and the vehicle seemed to match the description of Hansen's. But the real breakthrough came when investigators connected the dots between Hansen and the man who had been seen arguing near the canyon's edge. That man, with the triangle tattoo, was now firmly linked to Hansen, and it seemed more likely that he had been involved in the attack on the Langfords. The discovery raised even more questions. If Hansen had been at the scene, what was his connection to the Langford family? The investigators couldn't ignore the fact that he might have been the last person to see the family alive. His presence near the trail where the family had been camping, coupled with the argument witnessed by the guide, placed him in the immediate vicinity of the crime. The tension surrounding his involvement grew, but there was still no solid proof to directly link him to the crime. As the investigation deepened, Hansen's past began to come under scrutiny. His history as a private guide meant that he was often alone in remote areas of the park, and he was familiar with the locations that others would never venture into. The more investigators learned about Hansen, the more it seemed that he had the opportunity and knowledge to commit the crime. The link to the mysterious man with the triangle tattoo seemed to suggest a deeper connection, one that was now starting to take shape. Despite the mounting suspicion, Hansen was elusive. He had disappeared from the radar shortly after the Langfords' bodies were discovered, and no one could locate him. His phone went silent, and his usual routes in the area went untracked. The absence of any concrete evidence linking him to the murder made it difficult to charge him, but the growing number of leads pointing towards him could not be ignored. Was Hansen the killer, or was he simply another victim of circumstance in the wrong place at the wrong time? In the following weeks, investigators began to piece together a disturbing theory. Hansen's presence in the park on the night of the murders, his connection to the mysterious man with the triangle tattoo, and his extensive knowledge of the area all began to suggest a calculated act. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that the Langford family had likely walked into a trap set by someone who knew the terrain and who was perhaps more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The case was far from solved, but the investigators were getting closer to the truth. With each new clue, the veil of mystery surrounding the Langford family's deaths was beginning to lift, and Hansen's role in the tragedy seemed more likely than ever before. Still, the big question remained: was Greg Hansen the man responsible for the deaths of Mark, Lisa, and Andrew Langford? And what had driven him to commit such a heinous act? The investigation was far from over, but the twist in the case had set the stage for a dark and gripping conclusion that no one could have predicted. As the investigation into the deaths of Mark, Lisa, and Andrew Langford deepened, the search for Greg Hansen, the prime suspect, became the focal point of the authorities' efforts. Despite mounting suspicions and a growing body of evidence pointing towards him, Hansen had seemingly vanished without a trace. His disappearance was as eerie as the crime itself, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. By September 2020, the FBI had become involved, distributing a nationwide bulletin about Hansen, hoping to find any trace of the man who had so far evaded capture. His image and description were sent out across the states, with a particular focus on areas where he had been known to operate, including Montrose and other nearby towns. But despite these efforts, no credible leads emerged. Hansen remained elusive, his whereabouts a mystery. The authorities' frustration grew as each month passed without any concrete evidence linking Hansen to the crime scene or providing a clue to his location. His phone had gone silent, and his usual hangouts, local fishing spots, and rafting trips had not provided any new information. He had effectively disappeared from the radar, making it difficult to track him down. The case seemed to stall, and with each failed attempt to locate him, the weight of the investigation began to feel like an insurmountable challenge. Then, in early May 2020, after months of thorough analysis, the investigation hit another crucial juncture. Despite the continued search, the leads remained sparse. The authorities were still operating on the theory that Hansen was somehow involved in the murders, but without any direct evidence linking him to the scene or new witnesses coming forward, the case remained at a standstill. Investigators concluded that the most likely scenario was that Hansen had fled the area after the crime, either by boat or vehicle, and had successfully managed to evade authorities. The theory suggested that Hansen, being familiar with the remote areas of the canyon and its surrounding terrain, had used his knowledge to disappear into the wilderness, taking the most discreet routes to avoid detection. With no sightings of Hansen and no breakthroughs in the investigation, the team was forced to consider other possibilities. They turned their attention to other potential suspects, but none seemed to fit the profile as neatly as Hansen did. His criminal history, his presence in the park around the time of the murders, and the physical evidence linking him to the crime made it difficult to dismiss him as the main suspect. But with no further clues to pursue, investigators were left with the uncomfortable reality that they might never find Hansen or solve the case. As the months dragged on, the frustration grew. The Langford family's tragic deaths had become a cold case, and the authorities seemed to be running out of options. The lack of progress led many to question whether the truth would ever be uncovered or whether the killer would remain free, hiding in plain sight. Despite these setbacks, the investigation didn't come to a complete halt. The authorities continued their search for Hansen, keeping an eye on his known associates and tracking down any potential witnesses who might have seen him in the months after the crime. But the search was growing increasingly disjointed. While new information came to light occasionally, nothing substantial enough to break the case open materialized. Hansen's disappearance seemed to be an intentional and well-planned escape, leading many to believe that he had been preparing for this moment for some time. For the investigators, the lack of solid leads was disheartening. They were left to wonder whether Hansen had planned the murder with such precision that he knew exactly how to cover his tracks. His ability to disappear without a trace, despite all the resources dedicated to finding him, painted a chilling picture of someone who was either incredibly clever or just incredibly lucky. As the investigation dragged on, the evidence that had once seemed so promising began to lose its impact. The trail had gone cold, and with no new breakthroughs, the case seemed destined to remain unsolved. The FBI's efforts to track Hansen and the numerous public appeals for information seemed to fall on deaf ears. The case, which had once captivated the public's imagination, was fading into the background as the cold reality of the unsolved crime settled in. The authorities, however, didn't give up. They continued to follow any lead that came in, no matter how small, and re-examined all the evidence they had gathered. The hope was that eventually, someone, somewhere, would come forward with information that would crack the case wide open. Until then, the search for Greg Hansen remained at the forefront of the investigation, with the authorities clinging to the belief that the truth would eventually emerge, even if it seemed a distant hope. The investigation into the Langford family's tragic deaths hit a dead end, but the determination to find justice for the victims never wavered. As time passed, it became increasingly clear that this case would require a breakthrough, something that could push the investigation into a new direction. But with each day that passed without news of Hansen's whereabouts, the question of whether the truth would ever be uncovered loomed larger. The search continued, albeit without much hope, and the case remained a haunting reminder of the unresolved tragedy that had claimed the lives of the Langford family. By the summer of 2022, after years of tireless searching, federal agents reluctantly acknowledged that their efforts to track down Greg Hansen had been unsuccessful. Despite distributing bulletins across the country and exhausting every possible lead, Hansen had simply disappeared. The lack of new evidence or credible sightings left the authorities with no choice but to accept that they were at a dead end. His knowledge of the remote areas around the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, combined with his ability to evade detection, made him an elusive target. Yet, even as the investigation stalled, the case of the Langford family's tragic deaths remained open, with hope still lingering that new clues or fresh leads might eventually surface. Theories about Hansen's involvement continued to circulate, but with no concrete evidence, the mystery remained unsolved. The case, once filled with so much promise, had become a haunting reminder of the dangers that lie hidden in the most remote corners of the world. While the authorities may have had little to go on, the question remained: what had happened to the Langford family, and what drove someone to commit such a chilling crime? The truth, for now, remained locked away, shrouded in mystery. If you've found this story intriguing, and if you want to stay updated on this and other chilling true crime cases, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Join us as we continue to explore the dark corners of real-life mysteries, bringing you the truth piece by piece. Stay tuned for more, and thank you for watching.